There is a country sitting on top of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, a country that has accumulated over $700 billion in sovereign wealth, a country whose ruling family controls more personal wealth than almost any institution on Earth. And yet, if you talk to the economists who actually study this place, not the ones on government payroll, not the ones doing business deals with the royal court, but the independent analysts who run the numbers honestly, they will tell you something that sounds impossible. They will tell you that Saudi Arabia, as it currently exists, has somewhere between 15 and 25 years before its entire economic model collapses. Not declines. Not struggles. Collapses. And the reason why is hiding in plain sight. To understand what is happening to Saudi Arabia right now, you have to go back to 1938. That is the year American geologists, working for a company called Standard Oil of California, struck oil in the eastern province of what was then a young and deeply poor kingdom. The discovery was so large that the team initially thought their instruments were broken. They were not. What sat beneath that desert sand was the Ghawar oil field, still the largest conventional oil field ever discovered in human history. Almost overnight, one of the most resource-poor regions in the world became the most resource-rich. The kingdom that had existed on pearl diving, pilgrimage fees, and subsistence agriculture was suddenly sitting on a license to print money. And for the next 80 years, that is essentially what Saudi Arabia did. It printed money. It did not need to build a tax base. It did not need to develop industries. It did not need to educate its population for a competitive global economy. It simply pumped oil out of the ground, sold it to the world, and used that money to buy social peace at home. The model worked extraordinarily well for a very long time. The Saudi government built one of the most generous welfare states on earth. Electricity was nearly free. Gasoline was nearly free. Water was subsidized. Education was free through university. Healthcare was free. Saudis paid no income tax. Many government employees showed up to work, collected a salary, and did very little, and nobody said anything, because the oil money covered it all. This arrangement created something that economists call the rentier state, a government that does not need to tax its citizens because it earns its revenue from natural resources, and in exchange, its citizens do not demand political accountability. No representation without taxation, as it were. The implicit contract in Saudi Arabia was simple. The royal family keeps the oil money and the political control. The citizens get a comfortable, subsidized life and stay out of politics. For decades, this was a stable, if deeply unequal arrangement. But here is where the problem begins. Every deal has a cost, and the cost of Saudi Arabia's deal with its own people has been quietly compounding for 50 years. Invisible in the good times and now catastrophically visible in the present. The first cost is demographic. Saudi Arabia's population has exploded. In 1970, the country had roughly 6 million people. Today it has 36 million. That is a six-fold increase in 50 years, and that population was promised, implicitly, the same cushy deal that their parents and grandparents received. Free services, government jobs, subsidized everything, but the math does not work. When the oil money was divided among 6 million people, it was transformative. When it is divided among 36 million, it becomes strained. When it is divided among the 60 or 70 million Saudis projected by mid-century, it becomes arithmetically impossible, especially because the oil that funds all of it is being consumed faster, valued differently, and competed against more aggressively than at any point in history. The second cost is structural unemployment, and this one is particularly dangerous because it is largely hidden behind the official statistics. Saudi Arabia has an official unemployment rate that looks manageable on paper, but what the official numbers do not tell you is that the vast majority of private sector jobs in the kingdom are held not by Saudi citizens, but by foreign workers. There are approximately 13 million expatriate workers in Saudi Arabia, mostly from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Arab world, who do the actual physical and technical labor that keeps the country running. Construction, logistics, hospitality, retail, manufacturing, domestic service, all of it is dominated by foreign workers who are paid far less than Saudis would accept. live in conditions Saudis would refuse, and send their wages home rather than spending them in the local economy. Meanwhile, Saudi citizens, conditioned by generations of government employment and generous welfare, are largely unwilling or unprepared to take private sector jobs. The result is a peculiar double crisis: mass unemployment among Saudi youth and mass importation of foreign labor simultaneously. The government has tried for 20 years to fix this through what they call Saudization programs, essentially mandating that companies hire more Saudi nationals. The results have been underwhelming because you cannot mandate cultural and educational readiness into existence by decree. The third and perhaps most existential cost is the oil curve itself. Saudi Arabia needs oil to stay above approximately $80 per barrel to balance its national budget. In years when it trades higher, the kingdom runs a surplus and everything feels fine. In years when it drops, as and fies and suas, as adwise and Satan trines, it has repeatedly and will continue to do as renewable energy accelerates globally. The kingdom burns through its reserves at an alarming pace. The International Energy Agency has projected that global oil demand will peak sometime in the mid-20s and begin a structural decline thereafter as electric vehicles, solar power, and efficiency improvements reshape the global energy economy. Saudi Arabia knows this. The kingdom's leadership knows this better than almost anyone, because they have access to the private forecasts of the world's largest oil companies, the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, and the world's most sophisticated energy economists. And what those forecasts tell them is simple and terrifying. The window to transform the Saudi economy before oil becomes structurally less valuable is not 100 years. It is not 50 years. It is somewhere between 15 and 25 years. After that, the leverage disappears. And if the transformation has not happened by then, the consequences are not merely economic. They are political, they are social, they are existential for the House of Saud itself. This is the context you need to understand Vision 2030. In 2016, a young and ambitious prince named Mohammed bin Salman, known internationally as MBS, unveiled what he called a transformation plan for the Saudi economy. Vision 2030 was, on paper, one of the most ambitious national economic restructuring plans in modern history. The goal was straightforward: reduce Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil revenues from over 90% of government income to something far more diversified, build a thriving private sector, develop tourism, create a world-class entertainment industry, position Saudi Arabia as a logistics hub, a technology hub, a financial hub, get 1 million Saudi women into the workforce, make the country a destination rather than just a transit point for oil money. The marketing around Vision 2030 has been extraordinary. Saudi Arabia hosted Formula One races. It brought in the world's biggest musical acts. Everyone from Mariah Carey to David Guetta performed in Riyadh. It launched Eniom, a futuristic mega project in the northwestern desert that promised to build a completely new city powered entirely by renewable energy. It allowed women to drive for the first time in the kingdom's history. It opened cinemas after a 30-year ban. It built sports stadiums, signed global sports partnerships, and began hosting international golf tournaments and boxing matches and wrestling events. And if you watched the international press coverage, you might have concluded that Saudi Arabia was transforming successfully, that MBS was pulling off something remarkable. But when you look beyond the spectacle and examine the actual economic data, a more complicated and in many ways more troubling picture emerges. The private sector outside of oil and government spending remains underdeveloped. The manufacturing base is thin. The technology sector is almost entirely imported. Tourism revenues, while growing, remain a fraction of what comparable economies generate. NEOM, the flagship project, meant to demonstrate Saudi Arabia's futuristic ambitions, has been scaled back significantly from its original vision, with multiple senior executives and the project's own employees describing internal chaos, unrealistic timelines, and construction conditions for migrant workers that have drawn international human rights scrutiny. The reforms have been real in some areas. Women's rights have genuinely expanded in meaningful ways. The entertainment sector is genuinely growing. But the deep structural transformation, the one that matters economically, the one that would create a self-sustaining, tax-based, productive private economy that can survive without oil, that transformation is not on track. What makes this particularly acute is the youth problem. Saudi Arabia is one of the youngest countries on earth by median age. Over 60% of the Saudi population is under 30. This is simultaneously the kingdom's greatest asset and its most pressing liability. If those young people were educated, employed, productive, and entrepreneurial, they would represent an extraordinary engine of economic growth. But the Saudi education system, funded generously, but designed primarily to reinforce religious and cultural values rather than produce competitive global workers, has consistently ranked among the worst in the developed and developing world on international assessments of math, science, and reading. Saudi students perform below the global average on the PISA tests, which measure educational competency across countries. A generation of young Saudis has grown up expecting government employment, expecting subsidies, expecting the oil economy to provide, and many of them are simply not equipped with the skills that a diversified private economy requires. The government knows this. Reforming the education system is explicitly part of Vision 2030. But educational transformation takes a generation. You cannot reform a school system and harvest the results in 5 years. You reform it today, and see the results in 20 years. And 20 years, as we have established, is approximately how long the oil window has. The young men in particular face a structural trap. They were raised to believe that a government job, comfortable, undemanding, well paid by developing world standards, was their birthright. Now the government is telling them, with some urgency, that there are no more government jobs, that they need to work in the private sector, that they need to compete with foreign workers and with regional economies, that they need to be entrepreneurial, and they are looking at a private sector that offers lower wages, less security, and less prestige than a government position, and many of them are simply opting out. The result is a youth unemployment rate that, depending on how you measure it and who is measuring, runs somewhere between 15 and 40% when you include discouraged workers and those in nominal government positions that provide income but no actual productivity. This is not a stable situation. Young, educated enough men with no genuine employment and no sense of future are historically the fuel for every major political crisis in the Middle East. Then there is the water problem, which almost nobody discusses in conversations about Saudi Arabia's future, but which may ultimately be more limiting than oil. Saudi Arabia is one of the most water-scarce countries on Earth. It sits on an enormous aquifer system, underground reserves of fossil water that accumulated over thousands of years and cannot be replenished on any human-relevant timescale. For decades, Saudi Arabia pumped this water to grow wheat in the desert, an agricultural policy so economically irrational that it was eventually abandoned, but not before depleting a significant portion of those aquifers permanently. Today, Saudi Arabia gets roughly 50% of its fresh water from desalination plants, facilities that take seawater from the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and remove the salt. These plants are among the largest in the world. They are also almost entirely powered by burning oil, which means that Saudi Arabia is literally burning its most valuable export to produce fresh water. And as the population grows, the water demand grows, and the cost of that energy-intensive desalination grows with it. There is no clean solution to this in the near term. Climate change is making the Arabian Peninsula hotter and drier. Groundwater levels continue to fall, and the financial cost of keeping 36 and eventually 60+ million people hydrated in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth is a permanent and growing drain on the national budget that is almost never included in projections of Saudi Arabia's fiscal sustainability. The geopolitical dimension adds another layer of fragility. Saudi Arabia sits in arguably the most volatile neighborhood on the planet. To its north lies Iraq, still recovering from decades of conflict and Iranian influence. To its east across the Gulf lies Iran, the kingdom's primary regional rival, a nation that has spent 40 years supporting proxy forces throughout the Arab world and views Saudi Arabia as both an ideological enemy and a strategic competitor. The Yemen War, which Saudi Arabia entered in 2015 with a stated goal of a quick military victory, has become a decade-long humanitarian catastrophe that has cost the kingdom an estimated $100 billion in military spending alone. Money burned in a conflict that produced no strategic gain and significant international reputational damage. The Abraham Accords and the more recent normalization gestures toward Israel have reshuffled some regional alliances, but the underlying tensions, Sunni versus Shia, Arab versus Persian, monarchy versus revolutionary theocracy, have not been resolved. They have been temporarily managed, and the domestic military spending required to maintain the kingdom's security posture in this environment consumes a share of national revenue that compounds every other fiscal challenge. So let us bring this back to the central question. Can Saudi Arabia actually transform itself in time? Is Vision 2030 in Gurbi and Dam, Obidsbains, Masensanem, is this or whatever comes after it, in science running Dapbras is capable of delivering the kind of economic diversification that would allow the kingdom to thrive in a post-oil world? The honest answer based on the evidence available, in Centralkarin, Napper Din, Samadapari, in Sapari is possibly, but only if things go far better than they are currently going, and only if the political will to make genuinely painful changes can be sustained over a long enough timeline. The reforms that Vision 2030 requires are not just technical. They are not just a matter of building stadiums and attracting tourists. The deep reforms, the ones that would actually create a self-sustaining economy, require things that are politically extremely difficult for an absolute monarchy to deliver. They require genuine rule of law, so that private investors trust that their contracts will be honored and their assets will not be arbitrarily seized. They require freedom of expression and open, intellectual culture, so that the innovation and entrepreneurship that drives modern economies can flourish. They require tolerance of failure, because entrepreneurial economies fail constantly and learn from failure, something deeply at odds with the culture of face-saving and hierarchy that pervades Saudi society. They require empowering women fully and completely, not just allowing them to drive and attend concerts, but giving them genuine legal autonomy and equal standing in business, which runs directly against the deeply conservative religious establishment that the royal family has relied on for legitimacy for 100 years. None of these things are impossible, but they are all politically costly, and MBS, for all his ambition and genuine willingness to break some taboos, is still the leader of an absolute monarchy that derives its legitimacy from a combination of tribal loyalty, religious authority, and oil-funded social welfare. When the oil money runs thin and the social welfare has to be cut, when the reforms required are ones that threaten the power base of the religious establishment or the tribal networks that support the royal family, will the political will to continue be there? History suggests that the answer is very often no, that leaders who set out to transform their societies tend to reform the things that are easy and stop when the hard reforms arrive. Here is the thing that makes Saudi Arabia's situation different from every previous version of this story, different from the Soviet Union, different from Venezuela, different from every other petrostate that failed to diversify. Saudi Arabia has the money to attempt this transformation right now. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Public Investment Fund, has nearly $700 billion in assets and is growing. That is real capital that can be deployed to build industries, fund education, attract foreign expertise, and cushion the population through the painful transition. The question is not whether Saudi Arabia has the resources to attempt transformation. It clearly does. The question is whether the political structure that controls those resources has the will, the wisdom, and the longevity to make the choices that transformation actually requires, rather than the choices that maintain power in the short term while the long-term clock continues to tick. And that is why economists who study this carefully are not predicting Saudi Arabia's collapse with certainty. They are predicting it as a high probability outcome if the trajectory does not change more fundamentally than it has so far. They are saying that the window is real, the clock is real, the math is real, and the current pace of genuine structural reform does not match the pace of the challenge. Every empire, every dynasty, every seemingly unshakable power structure in history has faced a moment when the deal that sustained it stopped working, when the bargain between rulers and ruled broke down because the resources that funded the bargain ran dry, when the people who had been kept comfortable and quiet by subsidized abundance suddenly found themselves with nothing and started asking questions that monarchies cannot afford to answer. Saudi Arabia is not there yet. The oil money is still flowing. The Sovereign Wealth Fund is still full. The stadiums are still being built and the Formula One cars are still racing, and the concert lights are still on. But the engineers who built the system understand what the gauges are saying. They understand that the oil fields that have sustained this kingdom for 80 years are not eternal, that the world is building different kinds of engines, that the thing that made Saudi Arabia powerful was always temporary. And don discharge was then and the clock that was always running in the background is running faster now than ever before. The question is not whether Saudi Arabia will face this reckoning, it is whether the people in power right now have the courage and the wisdom to lead the transformation before the reckoning arrives. Because if they wait, if they use the remaining oil revenues to maintain comfort rather than build foundations, then when the revenues finally thin, there will be no buffer left. No sovereign wealth fund large enough to substitute for a real economy. No education system ready to produce competitive workers. No private sector capable of absorbing a generation of young Saudis who were promised a world that no longer exists. $700 billion and a desert full of oil gave Saudi Arabia something almost no country in history has ever had. A warning before the crisis, with the resources to prevent it. What they do with that warning is the question that will define the kingdom's next 100 years, or whether there is one at all.